Please don't leave yet. The voice was so quiet I almost missed it beneath the hum of fluorescent lights and the steady rain tapping against the emergency room windows. I'd been halfway out of my chair, coat already zipped, after spending nearly 3 hours at St. Matthew's with Mrs. Callahan, my 74-year-old neighbor. She'd felt dizzy while carrying groceries upstairs. Her daughter had finally arrived to take over, and I was thinking about nothing more complicated than getting home, changing into dry clothes, and finding something to eat. Then I looked toward the voice. A boy sat 2 chairs away from where I'd been waiting. He looked about 8, wearing a navy hoodie and sneakers damp from the rain. A matching navy backpack rested between his feet. He wasn't crying. Somehow, that made me notice him more. He was sitting very straight, both hands gripping one backpack strap, trying hard to look like someone who wasn't scared. "Are you talking to me?" I asked. He nodded. Before I could say anything else, a nurse behind the reception desk looked over. "Jamie, you need to stay right there for me, okay?" "I know." The nurse glanced at me. "We're working on reaching his father." Security brought him over from the medical office building next door after he got separated from a supervised school group. His teacher is staying with the rest of the class, and a school administrator is on the way. We've contacted the school and are continuing to call his father. That answered several questions before I had to ask them. Jamie wasn't wandering around the hospital unnoticed. The school knew where he was. Hospital staff knew where he was. And nobody expected me to solve anything. I could still leave. I looked at the empty chair beside him. "You want some company?" Jamie nodded again. So I sat back down. "I'm Lucas." "Jamie." "Nice to meet you, Jamie. Although I usually prefer meeting people somewhere with better lighting." He looked up at the ceiling. "It's really bright." Emergency rooms seemed committed to making everyone look tired. A tiny smile appeared. "Good. I could work with that." Rainwater streaked the dark windows while nurses moved behind the desk. "Hey." Television, mounted in the corner, played a cooking show with the sound turned low. I nodded toward the vending machines. "Have you tried the crackers?" "No." Smart decision. "I had some an hour ago. I'm pretty sure the package was younger than the crackers." Jamie smiled again, this time enough that I could see one missing tooth near the side. "I had chips." Better strategy. For the next few minutes, we talked about safe, ordinary things. He liked baseball. I knew just enough about baseball to embarrass myself. He hated fractions. I told him everyone hated fractions until pizza was involved. He'd been with a school group visiting a science exhibit in the building next door when everyone moved outside during the rain. He'd gone back beneath an awning because he thought he'd dropped something. When he came back out, he couldn't find his group. A security officer found him and brought him inside, while staff contacted the school and his family. "Do you have a phone?" I asked. Jamie tapped the side of his backpack. "Dead." "That's unfortunate timing. Dad tells me to charge it every night." "Your dad sounds annoyingly correct." Jamie gave me a serious look. He usually is. Every minute or two, his eyes moved toward the automatic doors. I began noticing the pattern. Doors opened. Jamie looked up. A stranger entered. Jamie looked down again. "They called your dad?" I asked. "Yeah." "Then he knows where you are." Jamie nodded, but his fingers tightened around the backpack strap. "He'll come. I'm sure he will. Dad always comes." There was something different in the way he said it. Not confidence exactly. More like a promise he needed to believe. The nurse approached with a paper cup of water and crouched beside him. "We left another message, Jamie. Your teacher is still with your class, and the administrator is on the way. You're doing great." "Okay." After she walked away, Jamie stared at the water without drinking it. "My dad works at construction sites sometimes," he explained. "They're loud. He probably can't hear his phone." "That makes sense. He'll call back." "I believe you." Jamie finally took a sip. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Mrs. Callahan's daughter waved goodbye from across the lobby as they left, and I realized there was officially no reason for me to remain. Jamie noticed too. "Was that your family?" "My neighbor. So you can go home now." "Technically." His eyes dropped toward the empty chair between us. I stayed seated. "Unfortunately for you, I've decided I need to recover emotionally from those vending machine crackers." Jamie laughed softly. "That could take a while." "Exactly." Another set of headlights swept across the rain-covered windows outside. Jamie looked toward the doors again. "He'll come," he repeated. Then, almost as if he were explaining why those words mattered so much, he added, "He promised Mom before she died that I'd never have to wait alone." I stopped smiling. Jamie seemed unaware of how much he'd just told me. He simply kept watching the doors, waiting for the one person he was certain would eventually walk through them. For a few seconds, I didn't know what to say. Jamie had delivered the sentence with the simple certainty children sometimes used for things adults would spend years learning how to explain. His mother was gone. His father had made a promise. And somewhere between those two facts, waiting alone had become more than an inconvenience. I leaned back in the plastic chair and looked toward the rain-dark windows. Your dad sounds like someone who takes promises seriously. Jamie nodded. He does. Then we'll give him time to get here. His shoulders loosened slightly. I deliberately said we instead of you. I saw him notice. The automatic doors opened again, but this time it was a woman carrying an umbrella and helping an older man inside. Jamie watched them pass before looking down at his backpack. Mom used to say Dad worries professionally. Professionally? He's an engineer. That explains it. Jamie looked at me. What does that mean? Engineers are very good at thinking about everything that could possibly go wrong before breakfast. Dad does that. I knew it. He smiled. What do you do? I'm a freelance illustrator. You draw pictures? That's the version that makes my job sound more impressive. Can you draw anything? Anything is dangerous. I once tried to draw a horse and accidentally invented a new animal. Jamie laughed, and the sound seemed too warm for the cold waiting room. I pulled a small sketchbook from the messenger bag I carried for work. Want proof? He shifted closer while I opened to a blank page. What should I draw? A baseball player. You've chosen violence against my artistic confidence. He laughed again. I drew a deliberately terrible batter with an oversized helmet and tiny legs. Jamie studied it. That's bad. Thank you. Critics rarely appreciate the courage behind the work. His bat is backwards. He's innovative. Jamie took the pencil when I offered it and corrected the bat himself. Soon the page contained a baseball field, 2 crooked clouds, and a scoreboard showing a completely unreasonable score of 47-3. The normality of it seemed to help. He stopped checking the doors every 10 seconds. A nurse returned and told him the administrator had been delayed by the weather but was still on the way. His teacher remained with the rest of the class, and the hospital had continued trying his father. Jamie nodded politely. After she left, he said, Dad is probably at the riverfront project. Is that far? Maybe 20 minutes when it's not raining. He hesitated. They wear hearing protection sometimes. Then there's a good chance he hasn't heard his phone. That's what I said. And you were probably right. He looked relieved to have an adult agree with him. His dead phone was still inside the backpack, but he knew Grant's number from memory. The staff had already called it more than once. There was nothing else for either of us to do except wait. So we did. Jamie told me Grant made pancakes every Sunday, but always burned the first one. He said his father checked the front door twice before bed and packed lunches the night before because mornings were already dangerous enough. I learned that Grant disliked raisins, loved old movies, and had once driven 40 miles back to a hotel because Jamie had forgotten a stuffed bear. The picture forming in my head was of a man who treated fatherhood like a responsibility he could never afford to get. Wrong. What was your mom like? I asked carefully after Jamie mentioned her again. He thought for a moment. Funny. That's a good thing to be. She sang wrong words to songs on purpose. He smiled at the memory. Dad said she did it because it annoyed him. Did it? Yes. Then she sounds very successful. Jamie laughed, but his expression softened afterward. She got sick when I was 5. I'm sorry. Dad says I don't have to be sad every time I talk about her. I looked at him. Your dad sounds right about that too. He usually is, Jamie repeated. Almost an hour had passed since I first sat beside him. My stomach was reminding me that vending machine crackers weren't dinner, but leaving no longer felt like a reasonable option. Then the nurse behind the desk suddenly straightened and picked up the phone. Yes, this is St. Matthew's emergency department. Jamie stopped drawing. I watched his face change before we heard another word. The nurse listened, then looked directly toward him. Yes, Jamie Sullivan is here. He's safe. Jamie stood so quickly the pencil rolled onto the floor. Is that Dad? The nurse raised one finger, still listening. Yes, sir. He's right here with us. Jamie's entire body seemed to release a breath at once. The nurse gave directions, then ended the call. Your father is on his way, Jamie. How long? He said about 20 minutes, depending on traffic. Jamie sat again, but now he couldn't keep still. His knee bounced. He zipped and unzipped the front pocket of his backpack. I told you. You did. Dad always comes. Apparently your dad is annoyingly reliable too. Jamie smiled. 20 minutes became 28 because of the rain. Then 31. Finally, headlights swept across the windows, and the automatic doors opened. A tall man in a rain-darkened work jacket rushed inside, scanning the waiting room with an expression that made it obvious he'd spent every mile imagining this moment. Jamie was already on his feet. Dad. The man's eyes found him immediately. Relief crossed his face so completely that for 1 second, he seemed to forget everyone else in the room. Then his gaze shifted to me, sitting beside his son, with my sketchbook still open between us. And the relief in his expression changed into a question. Jamie crossed the waiting room before his father had taken 3 steps. Grant dropped into a crouch and wrapped both arms around him, closing his eyes for a moment as if he needed physical proof that his son was really there. Are you okay? He asked when he finally leaned back. Did you get hurt? Are you feeling sick? Did anybody examine you? Dad, I'm fine. You're sure? Yes. Grant looked toward the reception desk for confirmation. The nurse who'd been helping Jamie approached and explained that security had brought him directly to the waiting area after finding him separated from his school group. His teacher had remained with the other students while the school administrator headed to the hospital, and Jamie had stayed under staff supervision the entire time. I stayed where I was, suddenly aware that I was the only person in this reunion who didn't belong. Grant stood, one hand remaining on Jamie's shoulder. He was taller than I'd expected, probably around 6 feet, with rainwater darkening the shoulders of his work jacket. His brown hair looked like he'd pushed his hands through it repeatedly during the drive. Relief was still visible in his face. But when he looked at me again, something protective replaced it. Who are you? The question wasn't hostile exactly. It was the question of a father who'd spent the last half hour not knowing where his son was and had now discovered a stranger sitting beside him. I stood slowly. Lucas Bennett. I was here with my neighbor earlier. Grant's eyes moved to the sketchbook on the chair. And you know Jamie how? He doesn't. Jamie answered before I could. He stayed with me. Grant looked at him, then back at me. The nurse stepped in. Mr. Bennett remained here in the waiting area after his neighbor left. Jamie asked him to stay nearby while we continued contacting you. They've been in view of the desk the entire time. Grant's posture changed almost immediately. Some of the tension left his shoulders. I see. I was already sitting here, I said. Jamie seemed like he could use company. He drew a terrible baseball player, Jamie added. I looked at him. This feels unnecessary. The bat was backwards. We established that the player was innovative. For the first time, Grant's expression softened. It was brief, but I caught it. He looked down at the drawing, then at Jamie. You made this. We both did. I fixed the bat. Naturally. Grant exhaled and rubbed one hand over his face. When he looked at me again, the suspicion was gone, replaced by embarrassment. I'm sorry. I came through the door and saw someone I didn't know sitting with my son, and I reacted before I understood what was happening. You don't need to apologize. I probably do. Then apology accepted. He nodded once. And thank you. You really don't have to thank me either. I do. His voice was quieter now. You could have left. I glanced at Jamie. Apparently, I was recovering from vending machine crackers. Jamie laughed. Grant looked between us. I feel like there's a story there. Not a good one. The school administrator arrived several minutes later, apologizing repeatedly while explaining how Jamie had become separated during the confusion of moving the group through the rain. Grant listened carefully, asking practical questions without raising his voice. I noticed that he kept one hand lightly against Jamie's shoulder the entire time. When everything was settled, Grant thanked the hospital staff and helped Jamie put on his backpack. That should have been the end of it. I picked up my messenger bag and started toward the exit. Lucas. I turned. Grant stood beside Jamie near the automatic doors. Can I ask you something? Sure. He hesitated. How long were you here with him? About an hour and a half. Grant looked at Jamie. You waited that whole time? He was going to leave, Jamie said, but I asked him not to. Grant's eyes returned to mine. Something in his expression changed again. This time, I understood why. Jamie doesn't like waiting alone, he said. I figured that out. Jamie looked up at his father. I told him about Mom. Grant became very still. You did. Just that you promised her. A quiet moment passed between them. Grant looked toward the rain beyond the glass. Doors. Rebecca died 3 years ago, he said finally. Jamie was 5. I nodded. I'm sorry. Thank you. He looked down at his son, then continued. Before she died, she made me promise that no matter how complicated things got, Jamie would always know somebody was coming for him. His mouth tightened into a tired half smile. Tonight I missed 6 calls because my phone was locked in a side office while I was inspecting a section of the riverfront project. By the time one of my supervisors found me, I had messages from the hospital and the school. You came as soon as you knew. I know. Grant looked at Jamie, but he didn't know that. Jamie reached for his father's hand. I knew. Grant squeezed it. For a second, I felt like I was seeing something private. Not because they were hiding it, but because grief had built its own language between them. I shifted my bag onto my shoulder. You two should get home. We should. Grant took 2 steps toward the doors, then stopped. Lucas. Yeah. I still feel like thank you isn't enough. It is. What if I disagree? You're allowed to be wrong. That earned the first real smile I'd seen from him. It changed his whole face. Can I buy you coffee sometime? I almost told him it was unnecessary. Then I noticed he wasn't asking out of obligation anymore. At least, I didn't think he was. Coffee sounds fair. Grant pulled a business card from his wallet and handed it to me. Grant Sullivan, civil engineer. A phone number was printed beneath his name. Text me, he said. I will. Jamie smiled as though some private plan had worked perfectly. The automatic doors opened, letting in a rush of cold, rain-scented air. Grant and Jamie stepped outside together. Before following his son toward the parking garage, Grant turned once and looked back at me. It lasted only a second. Then he smiled again, and I found myself standing beneath the fluorescent lights, holding his card long after the doors had closed. Grant waited until Saturday morning to text me. That was exactly long enough for me to wonder whether the business card in my wallet had been nothing more than a polite ending to an unusual night. His message arrived. At 9:12 while I was standing in my kitchen deciding whether coffee counted as breakfast. I still owe you coffee. 11 at Harbor Street Cafe, if you're free. I read it twice before reminding myself that grown adults occasionally drank coffee without assigning emotional significance to punctuation. At 11, Grant was already seated near the front window when I arrived. He wore a charcoal sweater instead of the rain-soaked work jacket I remembered. Without the panic of the emergency room around him, he looked younger somehow. Calmer. You came, he said. You invited me. I wasn't sure you would. I sat across from him. I was promised coffee. I take contractual obligations seriously. You sound like an engineer. That's usually my line. He'd already ordered a medium roast for himself, but waited for me before getting food. I chose coffee and a blueberry muffin. When I returned to the table, Grant slid a folded sheet of paper toward me. It was the baseball drawing Jamie and I had made. I thought he kept this. He did. Then he told me I was required to show you the improvements. Jamie had added spectators, a scoreboard, and what appeared to be a hot dog floating above center field. He surpassed me. The hot dog is apparently a blimp. Of course it is. Grant smiled. There it was again. That unexpected change in his face whenever he stopped trying to look responsible for everything. For the first 20 minutes, conversation stayed easy. He told me the riverfront project was a pedestrian bridge and public park renovation. I told him freelance illustration meant spending half my life drawing things people loved and the other half sending invoices they mysteriously forgot existed. He laughed more than I expected. Then his expression grew thoughtful. I wanted to explain something about the other night. You don't have to. I know. I want to. He wrapped both hands around his coffee. When Rebecca died, Jamie was 5. For a while, he became terrified whenever I left the room. Grocery store, school drop-off, even if I went downstairs to do laundry. Grant looked through the window toward people passing on the sidewalk. He got better. We both did, but being separated from his group brought some of that back. That explains why he kept watching the doors. Grant nodded. And why I probably looked completely unhinged when I came through them. You look like a worried father. That's generous. I'm occasionally generous before noon. He smiled, then looked down at his cup. I've spent 3 years trying to make sure he never feels like he's losing somebody again. There was no dramatic break in his voice, just exhaustion beneath the words. Sometimes I think I've turned parenting into risk management. Jamie told me you worry professionally. Grant closed his eyes briefly. He said that. He also told me you burn the first pancake every Sunday. I'm reconsidering how grateful I am that you stayed with him. I laughed. Your secrets are safe with me. Apparently not with my son. The heaviness passed without disappearing completely. That seemed important. Grant could talk about Rebecca and still laugh 5 seconds later. Grief hadn't erased everything else about him. When our cups were empty, I assumed that was the natural ending. Grant checked his watch, and I started reaching for my coat. I should let you get back to your Saturday. Actually, he said, I have nowhere I need to be for another hour. I paused. Neither do I. There's a bookstore around the corner. Are you suggesting additional unpaid social interaction? I bought the coffee. True. Your contractual obligation has been fulfilled. Grant shook his head, smiling. Come on. We spent nearly an hour wandering through the bookstore. Grant went immediately to architecture and history. I found an oversized book of vintage advertising illustrations and accused him of judging my profession when he called one advertisement visually chaotic. He defended himself for 10 minutes. Outside, the morning had turned bright and cold, with leftover rain shining on the sidewalks. We stopped near the corner where our cars were parked in opposite directions. Thank you again, Grant said, for staying with Jamie. You already thanked me. I know. And you bought coffee. I know that too. Then we're officially even. Grant hesitated. What if I don't want to be even? The question landed differently than everything before it. I looked at him. His expression suggested he'd surprised himself too. That sounds suspiciously like you're trying to create another contractual obligation. Maybe lunch next time. That's a serious escalation. I'm willing to accept the risk. I smiled. Then lunch sounds good. Grant nodded. For a moment, neither of us moved. Finally, he slipped his hands into his coat pockets. I should pick up Jamie. He's with my sister. Tell him the hot dog blimp is artistically groundbreaking. I absolutely will not. We started in opposite directions. I'd made it half a block when my phone vibrated. I expected a client message. Instead, it was Grant. For the record, the bookstore was not part of the thank you. I stopped beneath a bare maple tree and read the sentence again. Then another message appeared. I just wanted to spend more time with you. I looked back toward the intersection. Grant was still standing there, phone in his hand, watching me from across the street. I smiled and typed the simplest answer I could think of. Good. So did I? After that Saturday, Grant stopped needing excuses. At first, his messages still arrived, disguised as practical questions. Did I know a good brand of colored pencils for Jamie? Could I recommend a sketchbook that would survive being carried in a backpack? Was the floating hot dog blimp actually possible from an aerodynamic perspective? I answered every question with the seriousness it deserved, which was almost none. By the following week, the questions changed. Grant sent me a photograph of the riverfront project at sunrise because he thought I'd like the colors. I sent him a drawing of an exhausted engineer holding 6 phones because he'd complained about a morning full of meetings. He replied that my understanding of civil engineering was offensive. I told him accuracy wasn't required in art. Lunch happened on Wednesday at a small sandwich shop near his office. Coffee happened again Friday morning. The next Sunday, Grant called while I was working at my apartment. I need an expert opinion, he said. That sounds expensive. Jamie has an art project due Thursday. I charge double for emergencies. He wants to draw the city skyline, and apparently my suggestion to use a ruler was deeply insulting. I'm beginning to understand why he called me. Grant laughed. Would you mind helping him sometime this week? Sure. There was a brief pause. And before you accuse me of inventing reasons to see you, this one is legitimate. I hadn't accused you of anything. You were thinking it. I was absolutely thinking it. I went to their house Tuesday evening with pencils, paper, and enough misplaced confidence to convince Jamie that perspective drawing was fun. Grant made spaghetti while we worked at the dining table. The house felt warm and lived in, with framed photographs along the hallway and books stacked beneath the coffee table. I noticed Rebecca without needing anyone to identify her. In one photograph, she stood beside Grant near a lake, both of them younger, laughing at something outside the frame. In another, she held Jamie as a toddler. The photographs weren't hidden. That told me something important about Grant. He wasn't trying to erase his old life. He was trying to understand how to keep living beside it. Dinner, Grant called from the kitchen. Jamie looked at his drawing. Can Lucas stay? Grant appeared in the doorway holding a wooden spoon. Lucas probably has plans. My plans involved leftover soup and answering emails. That sounds depressing. Thank you. Grant smiled. Stay for dinner. I did. Afterward, Jamie returned to his drawing while Grant and I cleaned the kitchen. He washed dishes. I dried them. It was painfully ordinary. which was probably why I noticed how comfortable it felt. You don't have to help, Grant said. I know. You're a guest. You fed me. I'm paying my debt. I thought we agreed to stop keeping track. I looked at him. Did we? Grant handed me a plate. I'm deciding that now. Our hands brushed briefly when I took it. Neither of us reacted dramatically. Grant simply looked at me for a second longer than necessary before turning back to the sink. That became the pattern over the next 2 weeks. Nothing dramatic happened, yet everything seemed to be changing. Grant started calling during his drive home. Sometimes he had a reason. Usually he didn't. We talked about clients, traffic, Jamie's latest baseball obsession, and the terrible first apartments we'd rented in our 20s. I learned Grant liked black coffee, old mystery movies, and music from the 90s. He learned I hummed while drawing and had somehow reached 30 without owning a proper toolbox. When a new desk arrived for my apartment, Grant volunteered to help assemble it. He showed up Saturday morning carrying his own tools. This is excessive, I said when he opened a case containing more equipment than I believed a desk could require. This is prepared. There are 12 pieces of wood. There are 16. You counted. Grant stared at me. Of course I counted. 2 hours later, the desk stood perfectly level against the wall. Grant sat on my couch drinking coffee while I inspected it. I hate that you were useful. You're welcome. Don't become arrogant. Too late. He smiled. The room became quiet in that new way I'd started recognizing, when neither of us seemed eager to end the time we were spending together. Grant checked his watch, but didn't stand. Jamie is with my sister until dinner. Okay. I'm just saying I don't have to leave yet. Okay. I repeated, trying not to smile. We ordered sandwiches instead. By the time Grant finally left, afternoon sunlight had disappeared from my windows. That night, at 11:14, my phone rang. Grant's name appeared on the screen. Everything okay? I asked when I answered. Yes. Jamie okay? He's asleep. Work? Fine. Silence followed. Then why are you calling me? Grant laughed quietly. I was hoping you wouldn't ask that. You called an illustrator after 11 at night. We require context. Another pause. I realized I don't actually have a reason. I leaned back against my couch. You could just say you wanted to call. Grant said nothing for several seconds. When he finally answered, his voice had lost the careful humor he usually used whenever things became personal. Maybe I did. I smiled into the quiet apartment. That's a perfectly good reason. Grant exhaled. Softly. Good. We talked for another 40 minutes about absolutely nothing important. And somehow, that was when I understood something had shifted. Jamie had been the reason Grant and I met. Gratitude had been the reason we met again. But neither one explained why Grant was still on the phone with me close to midnight. For the first time, there was no emergency, no favor, no debt, no excuse between us. There was only the fact that neither of us wanted to say goodnight. The following Friday, Grant invited me to dinner again. By then, I'd stopped pretending that spending time at his house felt unusual. Jamie met me at the door with his finished skyline drawing held against his chest like an award certificate. I got an A. Obviously. Your artistic consultant was exceptional. Grant called from the kitchen. Your artistic consultant told you buildings don't need rulers. They don't always need rulers, I corrected as I walked inside. Civilization depends on rulers, Grant said. That explains why engineers are so cheerful. Jamie laughed and carried his drawing upstairs while I followed the smell of roasted chicken into the dining room. Grant had already set the table. 3 plates, 3 glasses, 3 folded napkins. Then I noticed the 4th chair. It sat at the far side of the rectangular table, directly across from Grant's usual place. There was no plate in front of it. No glass. Nothing except an empty section of polished wood. I'd seen the chair during my first dinner there, but I hadn't thought much about it. This time, when I started to pull it back, Grant stopped moving. It was subtle. His hand remained suspended above the serving bowl he'd been carrying. His expression changed just enough for me to understand that I'd stepped towards something I couldn't see. Actually, he said, would you mind sitting over here? He indicated the chair beside him. Of course. I moved without asking why. Grant set down the bowl and continued as though nothing had happened. Dinner was good. Jamie explained the entire grading system for his art project. Grant complained that my influence had permanently damaged his son's respect for straight lines. I defended creative freedom with increasingly ridiculous arguments. But every few minutes, my eyes returned to the unused chair. After dinner, Jamie went upstairs to call a friend about weekend baseball practice. Grant and I carried dishes into the kitchen. He was quieter than usual. You don't have to explain the chair, I said. Grant stopped at the sink. I know. I mean it. He looked through the doorway toward the dining room. It was Rebecca's. I waited. Grant dried his hands on a dish towel, even though they weren't wet. She always sat there. Same chair, every meal. Jamie sat beside her when he was little, and I sat across from her. His mouth curved slightly. She complained that I stole food from her plate. Did you? Constantly. Then her complaint seems justified. Grant smiled, but it faded quickly. After she died, I stopped setting that place. I told myself it was temporary. He leaned against the counter. 3 years later, nobody sits there. Jamie never does? No. My sister tried once at Thanksgiving. I asked her to move before I even realized what I was saying. He looked embarrassed by the admission. That sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. It doesn't sound ridiculous. It's a chair. It's not really a chair. Grant looked at me. The silence that followed felt heavier than the conversation itself. I've spent 3 years making sure Jamie's life stayed stable, he said. Same house. Same school. Same Sunday pancakes. Same Christmas traditions. I thought if enough things stayed where Rebecca left them, maybe he'd feel like he hadn't lost everything. Did it help? At first. Grant looked toward the dining room again. Then I think I forgot how to tell the difference between keeping something and being afraid to change it. I didn't answer immediately. There was no sentence that could make that realization easier. You know what scares me? He continued. Not forgetting her. I know I won't. What scares me is wanting something different and realizing I might actually be happy if I let myself have it. I knew then that we were no longer talking about furniture. Grant knew it too. His eyes met mine and stayed there. Lucas, since you came into our lives, Jamie laughs about that hospital night instead of getting nervous when he remembers it. He talks about your drawings. He asks when you're coming over. He's a good kid. That's not all I mean. My heartbeat changed, but I kept my voice steady. Then what do you mean? Grant looked down, gathering words. I look forward to you coming over too. The room became very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming and faint footsteps upstairs. That doesn't have to be a bad thing, I said. I know. Do you? Grant gave a tired smile. I'm working on it. I glanced through the doorway at Rebecca's empty chair. Can I tell you what I think? Please. Leave the chair exactly where it is. Grant looked surprised. What? If leaving it there still means something to you, leave it. You don't have to prove anything by moving it, and nobody needs to sit there just because 3 years have passed. His expression softened. And when do I move it? When leaving it there stops helping. Grant stared at me for several seconds. You're not going to tell me I need to move forward? You're already moving forward. You just invited an illustrator to dinner twice. That's your evidence? Very compelling evidence. He laughed softly, then stepped closer. Not enough to make the moment something it wasn't, but enough that I could see the relief in his face. Thank you, he said. For what? For not asking me to make room for you by taking something away from her. The words caught me off guard. Grant, I'd never ask you to do that. I know. He looked toward the dining room one last time, then back at me. I think that's exactly why making room for you is starting to feel possible. After that Friday dinner, something between Grant and me became easier and more complicated at the same time. He didn't suddenly become fearless. I didn't expect him to. We simply stopped pretending that all those coffees, phone calls, and dinners were happening by accident. The next week, Grant met me downtown after work. Jamie was spending the evening with Grant's sister. So for once there was no art project, no family dinner, and no practical reason for us to be together. We ate at a small Italian restaurant. Afterward, we walked 6 blocks through the cold and somehow spent 20 minutes debating whether an engineer could survive a week without making a list. Of course I could, Grant said. You have a grocery list organized by aisle. That's efficient. You have separate sections for produce and dairy. They're in different parts of the store. Thank you for proving my point. Grant laughed. I realized how much I'd come to like that sound. It was different from his polite smile at the hospital or the careful humor he used when we first had coffee. This was easy. Unprotected. When we reached my apartment building, neither of us immediately said good night. Grant stood beside his car with his hands in his coat pockets while the streetlights reflected on the damp pavement. Jamie asked when you're coming over again, he said. Did he? Apparently his Skyline project has convinced him you're now responsible for every creative decision he makes until college. That seems fair. Grant smiled. He likes having you around. I looked at him. And you? The smile disappeared. Not because he was upset. Because I'd finally asked the question we'd been carefully walking around. Grant lowered his eyes for a moment. Lucas, you don't have to answer. That's not the problem. Then what is? He looked at me again. I know what the answer is. Neither of us moved. A car passed at the end of the block, tires whispering over wet pavement. Grant stepped closer, slowly enough that I could have moved away if I wanted. I didn't. For one suspended second, I thought he might kiss me. Instead, he stopped. His expression changed from certainty to something closer to fear. That's the problem, he said quietly. I understood before he explained. Wanting me was no longer hypothetical. Grant, you're allowed to take your time. I know. Nothing has to happen tonight. He nodded, but his eyes remained on mine. Good night, Lucas. Good night. He got into his car and drove away. I stood outside my building longer than necessary, watching his taillights disappear around the corner. The next morning, there was no message from him. That was unusual, but not alarming. By evening, there was still nothing. Sunday passed with one short text saying Jamie's baseball practice had gone well. Monday, Grant responded to a drawing I sent with a single sentence instead of the usual joke. Tuesday, he didn't call during his drive home. By Wednesday, the pattern was obvious. Grant was retreating. I could have confronted him. I could have reminded him of everything he'd said in his kitchen about making room for me. Instead, I gave him the same thing I'd offered at the dining table. Space without disappearance. I answered when he texted. I didn't manufacture reasons to contact him. I didn't ask Jamie to carry messages between us. Most importantly, I didn't turn Grant's fear into a problem I was entitled to solve. Nearly a week later, he called. Hey, I said. Hey. His voice sounded tired. I owe you an apology. For what? You know what? I know you've been quiet. I've been avoiding you. Hearing him say it directly hurt more than I expected. Okay. That's all you're going to say? What would you like me to say? Grant was silent. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Do what? Want something that was never part of the plan. I sat down on the edge of my couch. You told me engineers like plans. I was hoping you'd forgotten that. Unfortunately, I remember useful evidence. He laughed once, but the sound disappeared quickly. When I almost kissed you, I went home and stood in my kitchen thinking about what would happen if I had. Then I started thinking about next month. Next year. Jamie. Rebecca. Everything. That sounds exhausting. It was. Grant, I'm not asking you for next year. I know. I'm not even asking you for next week. Silence filled the line. What are you asking for, he said. Nothing right now. That answer seemed to surprise him. Lucas, you need to decide whether you want me in your life because you want me there. I can't make that decision for you. And if I take too long, I looked around my quiet apartment. Then I keep living my life. Grant breathed out slowly. That's fair. It's not punishment. I know. We ended the call a few minutes later. The days after that felt strangely empty. 3 weeks passed. I threw myself into work, including a volunteer project at St. Matthew's to paint a bright city mural in the pediatric waiting area. I'd mentioned the mural to Grant weeks earlier, back when we were still talking almost every day. He'd teased me about drawing structurally questionable buildings and asked what days I'd be working there. I told him Thursday afternoons. At the time, the conversation hadn't seemed important. On a Thursday afternoon, I was standing on a small step ladder adding clouds above the painted skyline when I heard the automatic doors open behind me. I barely looked up until a familiar voice said my name. I turned. Grant stood just inside the waiting area, alone, wearing his charcoal sweater beneath a dark coat. There was no panic in his face this time. No rain-soaked work jacket. No frightened boy waiting for him. Is everything okay? I asked. Grant looked at me for a long moment. For once, he said, yes. Then he stepped closer. I looked at him, then at the mural behind me. You remembered. Thursday afternoon, he said. You told me. And that was when I realized he hadn't simply ended up at St. Matthew's. He'd come looking for me. I stepped down from the ladder and set my paintbrush across the tray. Grant remained near the automatic doors as people moved quietly through the waiting area around him. For a moment, the fluorescent lights and rows of chairs made everything since that first night collapse into one strange circle. The first time I saw him here, he'd rushed through those doors looking terrified. Now he'd walk through them slowly, deliberately, and he was looking only at me. What are you doing here? I asked. Grant glanced at the mural behind me, apparently interrupting an artist. That depends. Are you here to criticize my buildings? I counted the windows. They're structurally questionable. There he is. Grant smiled, but the humor didn't hide his nervousness. Can we talk? I nodded toward a quieter section of the waiting area. We sat several chairs away from the reception desk, almost exactly where Jamie and I had waited months earlier. Grant noticed it too. This is strange, he said. A little. I almost turned around in the parking garage. Why didn't you? He looked at his hands. Because I've spent 3 weeks turning around. I waited. Grant took a slow breath. After our phone call, I tried to convince myself I was doing the responsible thing. I told myself Jamie had already been through enough change. I told myself Rebecca had been gone only 3 years. I told myself I should be completely certain before letting somebody new become important. That sounds very organized. I made an actual list. I stared at him. Of course you did. A reluctant smile appeared. It was a terrible list. Now I'm curious. You're never seeing it. Probably wise. His smile faded. The problem was that every reason I wrote down sounded responsible until I asked myself what I was actually afraid of. And what was the answer? Grant looked at me. Being happy in a life Rebecca never got to see. The honesty of it silenced me. I kept thinking that if I let myself want you, then I was choosing something that existed only because she was gone. He shook his head. But that isn't fair to her. It isn't fair to Jamie. And it's definitely not fair to you. Grant, you don't owe me a relationship because you feel guilty about disappearing. I know. Good. That's why I'm not here because I feel guilty. His voice steadied. I'm here because I missed you. I looked at him. I missed your calls. I missed you making fun of my lists. I missed seeing your coffee cup in my kitchen. I even missed finding pencils everywhere after you helped Jamie with his project. Those pencils were strategically placed. One was in the refrigerator. Creative process. Grant laughed. The tension between us loosened. Then he became serious again. I tried going back to the way things were before I met you. Work. Home. Jamie. Sunday pancakes. Everything exactly where it belonged. Including the chair? Including the chair. And it didn't fit anymore. He leaned back and looked toward the automatic doors. The first time I came through those doors, I was looking for my son. His eyes returned to mine. This time, I came looking for you. I felt the sentence settle somewhere deeper than I expected. That's dangerously close to being romantic for an engineer. I practiced it in the car. That explains everything. Lucas. Sorry. I smiled. Keep going. Grant shook his head, but he was smiling too. I can't promise this will always be easy for me. Rebecca is still part of my life. She's part of Jamie's life. There will probably be days when grief shows up without asking permission. I know. And Jamie comes first. He should. I need to go slowly. Then we go slowly. Grant studied my face as though searching for the condition I hadn't mentioned. That's it. What were you expecting? I don't know. A deadline. You really have been working around project schedules too long. He looked down and laughed softly. Probably. I rested my hands on my knees. I only need one thing. His expression became serious. What? If you get scared again, tell me. Don't disappear and decide for both of us. Grant nodded immediately. That's fair. I can handle complicated. I can't build anything with silence. He considered that. That sounded almost like engineering. Don't insult me. His laugh came easier this time. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Grant held out his hand between the chairs. Not dramatically, just openly. I looked at it before placing mine in his. His fingers closed gently around mine. The gesture was simple, but there was something different about it because this time he wasn't moving toward me and stopping. Would you have dinner with me Saturday? He asked. Is Jamie coming? He's staying with my sister. So this isn't an art consultation. No, not repayment for the emergency room. No, not an engineering emergency. Those are real, by the way. Grant. He smiled. It's a date, Lucas. I let him wait 2 seconds purely because he deserved it. Then yes. His shoulders relaxed. We sat there another minute, hands still joined, while the hospital continued around us. Eventually, Grant looked toward my unfinished mural. You should probably get back to work. Probably. Can I see it when it's finished? Only if you promise not to inspect the structural integrity. I can't make that promise. I stood. Grant stood with me. Before leaving, he looked at the row of chairs where Jamie had once waited. He still has that baseball drawing, you know. even with the backwards bat. Especially because of the backwards bat. I smiled. Grant squeezed my hand once before letting go and walking toward the doors. This time, watching him leave didn't feel like losing him. At the doors, he turned back. Saturday. 7. He nodded and disappeared into the afternoon beyond the glass. I climbed onto the ladder again and picked up my brush. Months earlier, I'd stayed in this room because a frightened boy didn't want an empty chair beside him. Now I understood that Grant had been living with his own empty chair for years. I wasn't here to take anyone's place. I was simply being invited to make a new one beside what was already there. 1 year later, I arrived at Grant's house carrying a paper bag of bread and found the dining room completely different. Not dramatically different. Grant would never allow anything in his house to change dramatically without at least 3 measurements and probably a spreadsheet. But the table had been turned 90 degrees so the afternoon light from the windows reached every place setting. And the chair that had once sat untouched across from Grant was gone. "You moved it," I said. Grant appeared from the kitchen wearing a charcoal sweater with the sleeves pushed up. "Hello to you too." "Hello. You moved it." "I moved several things. There are engineers somewhere experiencing unexplained anxiety." Grant took the bread from me. "Come here." He led me into the living room. Rebecca's chair stood beside the front window beneath a reading lamp. It was no longer isolated as something nobody was allowed to touch. On the seat was a small green cushion. Beside it stood a plant with broad leaves. A framed photograph of Rebecca laughing beside a lake rested on the nearby table. "That was her plant," Grant said. "Or technically the descendant of her plant. My sister kept taking cuttings because I'm terrible with anything that requires watering. You remembered to raise a child but forgot the plant. Jamie asks for breakfast. Plants lack communication skills." I smiled, then looked at the chair. "When did you move it?" "About 2 months ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" Grant considered the question. "Because I didn't move it for you." That answer made me smile more than anything else could have. Good. I finally realized I was keeping a chair empty because I thought changing its purpose would change what it meant. He touched the wooden back lightly. It didn't. Over the past year, I'd learned that Grant's biggest changes rarely announced themselves. They happened in ordinary moments. He stopped checking his phone every 5 minutes when Jamie was at baseball practice. He started taking Friday afternoons off occasionally. He finally admitted that my toolbox, which contained 1 screwdriver and a questionable measuring tape, wasn't technically a toolbox. We'd taken things slowly, just as he asked. Our first official date became another. Winter became spring. By summer, Jamie no longer asked whether I was coming to dinner. He simply assumed I knew what time to arrive. There were difficult days too. Rebecca's birthday came in May, and Grant became quiet before telling me why. Instead of withdrawing, he called. The 3 of us visited the lake from the photograph, brought sandwiches, and spent the afternoon listening to Jamie tell stories he remembered and stories Grant had told him so often they'd become part of his own memory. Nobody tried to make the day less sad. Nobody needed to. Grant had kept his promise from the hospital. When fear appeared, he told me instead of disappearing. That changed everything. "Lucas." Jamie's voice came from the dining room. "Dad says dinner is ready, but he's still standing there talking. Your father struggles with efficiency." "I heard that," Grant said. We returned to the dining room. Jamie was already seated, taller than he'd been a year earlier. The original baseball drawing was pinned to a corkboard on the wall behind him. The ridiculous hot dog blimp remained above center field. I laughed every time I saw it. Then I noticed my place at the table. There was a plate beside Grant's, a glass, a folded napkin, and one of my sketching pencils resting across the top as if it were part of the silverware. "What's this?" I asked. Jamie looked innocent. "Decoration. You put a pencil on my plate. It identifies your seat." Grant set a bowl of pasta on the table. Apparently place cards were too conventional. "I like it." I pulled out the chair. For just a second, I remembered another evening in this room, when I'd touched the wrong chair and watched Grant freeze. Back then, I'd worried that being welcomed into his life might require somebody else to disappear from it. A year had taught all of us otherwise. Rebecca's photograph was still in the living room. Jamie still talked about his mother. Grant still loved her. None of those truths made what existed between Grant and me smaller. "Sit down," Grant said. "Dinner is getting cold." I sat. Jamie immediately began describing a science project due the following week, while Grant objected to his plan to build something involving too much glue. I offered irresponsible creative support. Grant accused me of undermining him. It was ordinary, noisy, completely familiar. Halfway through dinner, Grant reached beneath the table and found my hand. He didn't look at me immediately. He simply held it while listening to Jamie explain why his science teacher would appreciate innovation. Eventually, Grant turned toward me and smiled. I thought about the emergency room 1 year earlier. The fluorescent lights, the rain against the windows, and the frightened boy staring at an empty chair beside him. Please don't leave yet. I'd stayed that night because Jamie needed someone nearby until his father arrived. I could never have known that Grant had been waiting too. Not in a hospital, but inside a life he'd carefully arranged around everything he was afraid to lose. I hadn't replaced Rebecca. I hadn't filled her chair. Grant had found a new purpose for it. And together, we'd made another place at the table. When dinner ended, Jamie carried his plate toward the kitchen. Grant leaned closer to me. You staying for coffee? I smiled. I thought you knew by now. His expression softened. I do. Outside, evening settled over the neighborhood while warm light filled the windows. There were still empty chairs in the house sometimes. There always would be. But none of them meant someone had been forgotten. And none of us had to mistake an empty place for the end of the story. Sometimes love wasn't about filling what had been lost. Sometimes it was simply about making enough room for memory and tomorrow to sit at the same table.